So for those of you who don't know me, I love fairy tales and superheroes and flowers. But most of all, I love happy endings. So in terms of superheroes, I identified most with Wonder Woman. I'm sure you all have your own favorite superhero. And so I go around now in my little Wonder Woman persona, and I defend the defenseless. So one of the things I defend all the time is estrogen. So those of you who don't know, estrogen is my favorite hormone, although I do love all hormones. And as you'll see, estrogen and PCOS, and actually everything, is linked together. And in terms of flowers, I love them all, because flowers, now you have to remember, I'm a board-certified OBGYN, and what are flowers? They're all about beauty and reproduction, right? It's the reproductive organ of the plant, and it's so beautiful, and we celebrate everything. What occasion is not celebrated with flowers, right? So flowers are wonderful. In terms of fairy tales, one of my favorites is Beauty and the Beast. And most of my women patients with PCOS, unfortunately, identify more with the Beast. Think of Cinderella. Can you imagine, you all can picture Cinderella from the Disney film, right? Can you imagine Cinderella, 50 pounds heavier, with cystic acne, a 5 o'clock shadow, and thinning hair? That fairy godmother would have a big job. And that's what our job is. Because fairy godfathers, fairy godmothers, that's our role, to give our patients the happy ending that they deserve. So I'd like to start with the story that is not a fairy tale. It's the story of my patient, Lori. So Lori is 25. She just recently got her MBA from a very, very top-rated school. She got her own apartment in Manhattan. And she is going today, this morning, on an interview for her dream job. So she got up out of bed and felt kind of tired, even though she'd gone to bed extra early. But she kind of tossed and turned all night. She went into the bathroom, immediately, went to go to urinate, and oh my God, there was blood. She hadn't had a period in 3 months. And this day, this most important day of her life, she starts bleeding. And she's like, oh my God, where are my tampons? I don't remember because I haven't had a period in 3 months. Well, she searches them, she found them. She meant to go out and buy more, but it just wasn't on her mind. So then she took a shower, and she's washing her hair, and she makes a little ponytail, and it's like that big. And she's like, what is with this? I'm 25, my ponytail is that big, and my hair is so thin, so I keep it really short, to try to fluff it. So, because if it was long, there'd be like nothing at the bottom. So then she goes and looks in the mirror. She gets out her razor to shave. Imagine that. And then she looks, oh no, I have another cystic acne thing coming out. So she gets her heavy-duty foundation to put it all over, to try to cover up the redness, the scars, and the bumps. She does her hair. She goes to get her dress that she wanted to put on at the end. She purchased a special dress, about a size too small, because she was going to lose weight to fit into it. Well, she couldn't get the zipper closed. So she went back to her closet and pulled out her black pants with the stretchy waist and a little, loose over top, and went off to her interview. Well, we'll come back to Lori in a little bit. So here is the most, I may say this again because I love most, the most important take-home message for this talk and everything else in life. The prime directive of life is the creation of new life. See, I went into OBGYN because I got that. Everything is about making babies. It is. Just look at the media, right? Everything is about making babies. Now, what use is it to have a woman conceive if she has poor health? Is she going to live through the pregnancy? Is she going to be able to be there to nurse her baby, to care for her child? We humans have a rather long adolescence. It takes a while before we reach reproductive maturity. And then we have to do it again. And then we have to do it again. And we have to do it again a few times because of infant-child mortality. In order to reproduce the species, you have to do it quite a few times. So nature evolved for female reproductive success, which means linking everything reproductive to everything metabolic. And you know that. That is so good. Because most doctors don't get it. They compartmentalize everything. I'm a unifier. I put everything back together. The female body is one, and estrogen links all these processes together. Estrogen is not about just reproduction. Estrogen is about survival. We'll see. Now, this is very important because we live in a toxic world, a very different world. When I say toxic, I don't just mean toxicants. I mean stress of every kind, toxic people, toxic relationships, toxic light that never turns off, so all kinds of toxicities. So I'm a very simple doctor. I believe I cannot micromanage the human body. The more I learn, the less I even think that I can do that. Of course, Big Pharma tries that. Do you ever look at the list of side effects of a pharmaceutical? That's because everything is multitasking in the body. I heard one of our earlier speakers, she has her favorite neurotransmitter. Remember that neurotransmitter, her favorite? Acetylcholine, right? That's why I'm entitled to a favorite hormone, if she gets a favorite neurotransmitter. Okay, so here's another thing. Sometimes in the afternoon, because you had lunch and you might fall asleep, I give pop quizzes. Remember, I'm a teacher. So I give pop, but I'm an easy grader because I want everyone to go home and, tell their friends, that they liked it. If I give everybody an F, they're not going to do that, right? There are teachers that actually do that, right? So, if the teachers get graded online by the students, right? At college, if they give too many bad grades, then nobody will take their class. So I want to make sure you all get good grades. So I'm giving you the answer. It's estrogen. You all know that. But sometimes I trick you and I give a different pop quiz. So that's to keep you on your toes or feet or, whatever's touching something. So in order to help our patients, we have to harness the innate mechanisms within our bodies so that we can heal ourselves. And I want to tell you, there are probably a lot of naturopaths in the audience. I ended up getting into integrative medicine by coming to Portland and taking Tori Hudson's classes a decade ago. And I said, who are these naturopaths? I don't even know who they are, but I like them. They're so friendly, and they say something that means something that I'd never heard before. We have to help the body to heal itself. And I've never let that go because I don't know how to micromanage the female body. So here is probably the most important slide, if you want to ever look at another slide from my lecture again. To be healthy, you have to have optimal hormones. I think you've heard that all morning long, right? So hormones, what the heck are they anyway? What do hormones do? Hormones are information delivery systems. So it would be like everyone on the planet spoke a different language. How would we communicate, right? The Tower of Babel had that story. So hormones give information. If you don't get the right information, or if you get no information, the cell won't know what to do. And estrogen is a big, important part of that, but so are all the other hormones. That's why it's a beautiful blend of all the hormones. Now, I know a lot of people don't do this, but if I was going to make a pyramid of hormones, what hormone do I put at the top of the pyramid? Come on, one person knows the answer. Yes, estrogen. But a lot of people put it at the bottom. That's why I am a superhero defending estrogen everywhere I go. So this slide shows you that in order to have optimized hormones, you need to have all these things in play. You've heard most of them today. So if you're going to memorize anything, memorize this, because this is what you need to actually do with your patients. Information is great, but if you don't do anything with it, it's kind of pointless. So I want today to be a day that when you go back to your practices, you actually have tools to accomplish at least some of these things. I know already many of you can do most of these things, but I want to give you some new tools. So what about my favorite hormone, estrogen? It's usually, and in gynecological world, thought of as a reproductive hormone. It's involved with making, periods and deals with breast, and usually it's demonized because it's involved with breast cancer when things go awry, right? So what it really is about is life. Estrogen is the first steroid receptor that there is. It goes back like 500 million years. Estrogen receptors existed before testosterone, cortisol, aldosterone, progesterone. All the other steroid hormones came later. The receptors came later. So estrogen was present in very premature creatures, but they didn't reproduce like humans, like mollusks. They have estrogen. So what is it about? It's about survival, metabolic homeostasis. So estrogen is about everything metabolic. So what is metabolic? It's the spark of life. It's the creation and distribution of energy. And you've heard a lot about energy. Estrogen is the master of it. So estrogen supports a wide variety of physiologic functions. In fact, it supports everything. There are estrogen receptors everywhere. You heard this morning about microglia and brain health. Estrogen has receptors all throughout the brain. And you guys out there in reproductive age groups, men make 6 to 8 times as much estradiol in their brains as women do. But women are okay. We pick up the slack. We make it in our ovaries. What about after menopause? Women have almost 3 times the incidence of Alzheimer's. And a lot of it's related to lack of estradiol in the brain. And the brain does not like estrone. In fact, the brain is one of the few tissues that doesn't even actively convert estradiol to estrone. It doesn't like it at all. And remember, all the studies on estrogen used like Premarin, and oral forms that turn predominantly into estrone. They do not support the brain. So the skin, the lining of arteries, estrogen is key to enormous numbers of enzymes in the body, including endothelial nitric oxide synthase, which keeps endothelial linings in arteries healthy and dilated, and muscle cells in arteries to keep them from constricting, the heart, full of estrogen receptors, and not only estrogen receptors, but receptors to estrogen metabolites. That's how important estrogen is in the brain, and even to things we don't even know. We used to call them orphan receptors, that they have, we don't even know what the ligand is, but if you don't have estrogen there, it doesn't work. Estrogen receptors that are, they're estrogen-related receptors, the ones that they used to call orphan receptors. Of course, you know that there's estrogen receptors in the breast. The estrogen is made, like in the brain. It's made in the brain in women too, but just less than in men. And estrogen is made in the breast. Estrogen is made in a paracrine function. It's made and used in the organ that it's made in. And that's happening in men and children. That's why endocrine disruptors for estrogen are just as damaging to men. And children, we know that affects the way their brains develop, right? So the breast, you already heard from wonderful talk with Dr. Evans that aromatase is upregulated by inflammation. That's very important, and let's just think why. Remember, everything in the body is for the purpose of survival, for the purpose of reproductive success. So why would the enzyme aromatase be upregulated with inflammation? It's because estrogen, is so key to what? To modulating inflammation. It's the body's response to inflammation by making more estrogen. So if you have dense breasts on a mammogram, particularly in a postmenopausal woman, because if you test a 20-year-old with a mammogram, are you going to find dense breasts? Of course, it's like whiteout, because they have so much estrogen, and they have proliferation of their ducts, right, and ductal cells. So if you have inflammation in an older woman, you're going to have upregulation of aromatase in the breasts, making more estrogen locally, and then you'll have dense breasts. So if you have that, that's a clue, right? Just like you heard endometriosis, clue, there's inflammation. Fibroids, clue, there's inflammation. Dense breasts, clue, there's inflammation. Chronic inflammation leads to DNA breakage, and estrogen can't fix it. Estrogen is there in the breast so that if you have a breastfeeding mom and she gets a breast infection, estrogen to the rescue to quell the inflammatory response so the baby doesn't die, and she doesn't get an abscess. It's modulating the inflammatory response. In the brain, estrogen modulates the inflammatory response of the microglia, so you don't get crazy, out of control inflammation in the brain. The GI tract, the liver, full of estrogen receptors. And as we'll see, estrogen is made in the gut itself. It's so important. The ovaries and uterus, of course, there are receptors, the bladder, the muscles, and I want to point out the mitochondria. We're going to talk more about that. The essential energy factories of this cell are controlled by estrogen. And of course, bones. A lot of people know that in menopausal women, there's an increased risk of osteoporosis. Well, so menopause is about hot flashes and osteoporosis. It's about everything, because it's all one body. It's not just bone. It's just that someone came up with a drug, the bisphosphonates. So suddenly, bone got on the radar. But you could pick muscle. You could pick heart. You could pick every organ, because every organ is going to be impacted by declining estrogen and immune cells. All of the immune cells in the body, the macrophages, the mast cells, the neutrophils, the B cells, the T cells, all have estrogen receptors. They all respond to estrogen. And when you don't have enough estrogen, or you have a lot of endocrine disruptors, or you have very imbalanced estrogen, you're going to have immune dysfunction. And women with PCOS have chronic inflammation. You've heard everything is about inflammation, and we'll see why. You probably have a little clue. It has to do with estrogen. So estrogen has tremendous protective roles in the body. So you can see all these different things. Estrogen controls many enzyme systems. For example, peroxidase 1, also known as PON1. You heard earlier about oxidized LDL earlier this morning. Estrogen prevents oxidation of LDL. Isn't that not surprising, right? Because estrogen is about survival. So estrogen is very important. Estrogen helps control the LDL receptors in the liver to help manage cholesterol. There was a paper just came out like 2 weeks ago. Shocker, women in menopause have elevated cholesterol. I know, doesn't that like shock you? It's like, we already knew that. Well, they don't have proper LDL receptor function. And you can look at the arteries, blood pressure. By the age, you'll talk more about it, but by the age of 75, 85% of women in the menopause have hypertension. Now, what the heck does that have to do with PCOS? As you'll see, the metabolic dysfunctions of PCOS are very much like the menopausal dysfunctions of menopause. But what makes women with PCOS different is how they have less estrogen in their bodies. Of course, it's quite a different reason, but the end effects are actually very similar. So here is from a study, a nice article showing what estrogen does and what happens when you don't have enough estrogen. As you can see, without enough estrogen, you have obesity, depending on all the organs. All these organs have estrogen receptors. You have insulin resistance. You have inflammation. You have fatty liver. You have impaired glucose function. So basically, you end up in a bad state, you can see all of these different cell types, all of these organs have estrogen receptors. So here's the mitochondria. Now, I wanted to point this out, that everywhere you see the little green, it says E2. E2 stands for estradiol. There's 3 forms of estrogen. E1 is estrone, E2 is estradiol, E3 is estriol. We now know that there are 3 types of estrogen receptors: alpha, beta, and membrane. And we used to think alpha was only on the nuclear receptor, on the nucleus of the cell. Now we know it's also on membrane. Same thing for beta, and then the membrane. So the nuclear receptors have to transcribe a protein. It's slow. The membrane receptors are really fast. They produce like a kinase, very rapid response. And in mitochondria, you can see it's E2. So estradiol works on all the receptors. That's the dominant estrogen made by the ovary. Estrone is predominantly alpha, and estriol is predominantly beta. And pregnancy is very different from any other time in a woman when there's a lot of estriol. Estriol is predominantly beta. High levels of beta downregulate alpha. And as we'll see, that's all about, once again, survival, because the alpha is on the innate immune cells, like the macrophages, the neutrophils, the mast cells. And the beta are predominantly on the B cells. So what happens is, in pregnancy, it's all about modulation, which involves progesterone too, so that you don't attack and kill the fetus as an alien invader. Right? So the immune system is very altered in pregnancy. So we have to think when we give biased, if that's okay or not, because you're giving a situation where you may be downregulating the innate immune system. And we know pregnant women have higher risk when they get certain infections. So we have to think about that when we start playing with it. Once again, I don't think I can micromanage estrogen receptors any more than I can micromanage anything else. So for me, estradiol is the key. But we'll see what everybody else thinks. So what about PCOS? Why do women have PCOS? What the heck is that about? Well, and why are PCOS women different from other women? Well, there's some theories that women have had PCOS, a mild version, since the beginning of humanity. And it was actually a survival advantage. What it was the ovary has aromatase. That's all estrogen comes from androgens, right? So the ovary makes testosterone, and then the testosterone goes down the assembly line, and the enzyme aromatase converts it into estradiol. So women with PCOS have a mild genetic inability, not like they can't do it, just reduced ability to convert testosterone to estradiol. Now, in ancient times, that was a survival advantage because it was a little bit of built-in birth control. Not enough that made them sterile, but maybe instead of having 8 kids, they had 4 or 5. They had more time with each child, fewer episodes of childbearing, which were risky. It's still risky. Maternal mortality is still a big issue. But then it was even bigger. So they had better survival, more time with each child, and they had a little bit of extra testosterone. So they were maybe a little bolder, braver, stronger. Maybe they were like the tribe leaders. And they've actually done studies of women who are Olympic gold medalists and found that a significant percentage had a mild form of PCOS. So I like to reframe PCOS for all my women patients, that you have the genes of a superhero yourself, that there's nothing wrong with you per se. It's what's happened with the world around you that has created these alterations, that have created all these problems for you. So what has changed? Pretty much everything. We have pollution, change in diet, and major problems with circadian rhythm from all the different electrical devices and blue light in our lifestyles. So if we look at just endocrine disruptors, like they're just huge everywhere, and they alter estrogen function. Most of the endocrine disruptors, they work on many different hormones, many hormones, but they almost all impact estrogen in some way, whether it's the production, distribution, receptor function, elimination, the biotransformation. Somewhere along the line, the estrogen is being impacted. Now that you know how critical estrogen is, particularly estradiol is, in the reproductive age woman, you can see the devastating effect that endocrine disruptors would have on female function. So all the things that I'm going to tell you are like magnified in women with PCOS, but they're applicable to every woman patient. So I think of PCOS as sort of the excellent example of the worst case scenario of how modern society has impacted on female health, reproductive health, and metabolic health. But all the different things that we'll go through apply really to all women. So if we look at PCOS, where did the name come from? It's because of these little cysts that form around the rim or cortex of the ovary. It's not there in every single woman with PCOS. These medical groups meet together and then they create diagnostic criteria. So the diagnostic criteria, now remember, this isn't nature, this is a group of doctors. And they've actually had different committees and changed their minds. You know how that happens. So the current thing is that in order to be diagnosed with PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome, you have to have two of the following three: abnormal menstrual cycles, right? Elevated androgens, either clinically or lab testing, ovaries that look like PCOS ovaries on ultrasound. So in this group, they actually said you can actually not have elevated androgens if you have the other two. That's like a whole new category of PCOS. I think that's really another category of PCOS. So that's just the rules of the game based on this committee. But if you just think of it as a process, that makes more sense than saying, you have this particular label. I think understanding processes makes more sense. So we'll see, why is this even happening? Well, actually, let's first look at what is happening. Here are the reproductive effects in terms of hirsutism, acne, alopecia. Those are very common because of the excess androgens. As well, chronic anovulation and major pregnancy problems. Both infertility, PCOS is the #1 leading cause of infertility of females, and it's hugely involved with pregnancy-related complications and high rates of miscarriage. So when women who can't get pregnant with PCOS walk into an infertility center, they usually immediately put them on fertility drugs or even do IVF. By the way, they have the lowest success rate for IVF because they have crappy ovaries, they're full of inflammation, and their oocytes are not very good. So they have the lowest success with IVF, but they put them, and they do it, and when they're successful, they often have major pregnancy complications, and then the children have problems because they're epigenetically modified, because we want women to be healthy before they become pregnant. And they also have hormonal receptor problems we'll talk about. In terms of metabolic effects, they have chronic inflammation, which leads to elevated insulin. They have dyslipidemia, visceral obesity, hypertension, endothelial dysfunction, fatty liver. These look like women in menopause because it is the same metabolic process. It's just a different reason for losing your estrogen or having estrogen deficiency or estrogen receptor problems or production problems. And it's more. Look at all these other things that women with PCOS have to put up with. They have high rates of autoimmune disease, particularly thyroid, but they also have higher rates of lupus. By the way, I didn't put it up here, but it was mentioned they have higher rates of endometriosis, uterine fibroids, and adenomyosis. So all of these things are higher in women with PCOS. So when you see them, don't forget they could have other things too. And they also have higher rates of arthritis and tendinitis because estrogen has receptors in the joints on ligaments and tendons, and higher rates of mood problems. Estrogen has receptors all over the brain, and estrogen is considered anxiolytic, reducing anxiety. And progesterone, of course, is not being produced either, and that is neuroprotective as well. And we'll see how that links, spoiler alert, with the endocannabinoid system. And vaginal infections, high rates of sleep apnea, sleep problems, and higher rates of certain cancers, particularly endometrial. So if we look at what's happening here, we can see that it's multi-organ involvement, of course. And if we look at the ovary, it shows that there's high FSH coming out of the pituitary and low FSH. And that's very important to know that women with PCOS probably have FSH receptor problems as well. And FSH is the trigger to aromatization. And you need to have that. You need to convert the testosterone to estrogen because you need to get that big spike. Remember you saw on the menstrual cycle picture, that big spike of estradiol to trigger ovulation along with the LH. You don't have that in women with PCOS very well because they're not aromatizing well. And it's compounded by problems with receptors in the hypothalamus to estrogen and FSH as well. And it leads to insulin resistance and more problems. And what happens as well is, you've all heard of anti-Mullerian hormone. That's often elevated, quite elevated in women with PCOS. So what is that about? So anti-Mullerian hormone is a really bad name for a hormone because it has to do with what's happening in the embryologic times, which, like, what does that have to do with anything? So, everything's a multitasker, so that's how they named it. But I would prefer to name it, if we took a vote and we had a committee, right, we could do that, then I would prefer to call it the follicle stimulating selector hormone or something like that. That's probably not the best name. But what it's doing, it's recruiting. I know, we should call it follicle recruiting hormone because it's recruiting the little follicles. And every cycle you get to recruit a bunch of follicles, and then by some miracle, one, occasionally two, then you get twins, but usually one of these follicles is selected. I call it the special one. And that special one gets ovulated out, and the other follicles regress. But in order for that to happen, you have to have suppression of your follicle recruiter called the anti-Mullerian hormone, and that is suppressed when you have the elevation of FSH, which isn't happening well. So the anti-Mullerian hormone isn't getting suppressed properly, and then you have ongoing follicle being recruited. So you have all these follicles recruited, and none is selected as the special one, and ovulation isn't happening. So see how simple that is. By the way, I do not believe that women with PCOS have prolonged reproductive lifespans. That makes absolutely no sense, and I scoured the literature for that, and I could find nothing to support that. And when you know that the reason for the elevated anti-Mullerian hormone isn't because they're so amazing and they have these special ovaries, they actually have ovarian inflammation, and when you take follicle fluid out, they find, I think this was kind of mentioned, lots of inflammatory cells. So inflamed ovaries have poor egg quality and shortened life. So that doesn't make any sense. So what is happening prenatally? During critical developmental times, women who develop the worst case scenario, that's why PCOS is a syndrome, there's many degrees of manifestation. Remember, some 20% are not even overweight, 80% are. They have different degrees of severity, and a lot has to do with your genetics and also the critical time during reproductive development, during the embryonic stage when these receptors are being formed and they're exposed to endocrine disruptors. So that, and you don't have a redo. We can't say, let's do that over. So critical exposure to endocrine disruptors, but not just during embryological times, but also during puberty times. So even though we can't go back and change embryo times, we can try to do that for future babies, right? Trying to get women healthy before they get pregnant, but we can still do a lot of good. And then there's also data that hormonal fluctuations during pregnancy, like high levels of testosterone during the pregnancy and high levels of anti-Mullerian hormone during the pregnancy can really also impact. So we've got to get the women healthy to stop this trend of women having more PCOS babies. If you have PCOS, a patient with PCOS, there's a very high percentage chance, at least 50%, that her mom will have PCOS, her sisters will have PCOS, and even when the mom doesn't have PCOS, she has at least a 60% higher chance of developing diabetes. So there's still something going on there in our environment that may promote diabetes in the moms. And of course, all the lifestyle things we'll talk about more. So in terms of metabolic endocrine disruptors, they're everywhere. We can breathe them, eat them on our skin, everywhere. And they affect basically every single function. And the end result is higher rates of obesity, insulin resistance, diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia, all the metabolic ills. So you know they have a name for that, right? Diabesogens. And it doesn't just apply to women with PCOS, but it applies to them in that they have the worst case manifestations because of their innate ability to make enough estrogen. So they've actually done studies and found that at every age, women with PCOS have higher levels of BPA in their bodies. So probably it's more than just that they can't convert into estrogen, or maybe it's because of that, because they can't eliminate as well. So you know, it's not just what you're exposed to, it's how you get rid of it. So they are more likely to hold on to have a higher toxic load. I've done this, just like one paper studied on this, but I'm looking at it. My worst case manifestations of PCOS patients seem to have the homozygous MTHFR. You've seen that too? I think, and we need to do more studies. By the way, women with PCOS have the lowest rate, well, not the women, but the researchers have almost no money. In fact, from year to year, the amount of research in the US on PCOS is declining. Most of it is only about infertility, not about overall metabolic health. Many of the best papers are coming out of places like China and Iran and India, where they are massively impacted with PCOS. I was in India last year. They were estimating at like as many as 39% of women may have PCOS. This is like a crazy epidemic. We have no data collection. How do they even know? They look at what is coded by a doctor visit. How many people code PCOS when a woman comes in with hirsutism or acne or irregular cycles or infertility? They use a different code. So it's very underestimated. It's anywhere, we think, up to 25% now of women. I mean, it's huge. It's like crazy huge. So, and by the way, higher levels of BPA in both the lean and the heavy women with PCOS. So if we look here, you can have exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals when you're in utero, right? And then it affects the development of the reproductive system, those critical hormone receptors that are everywhere for estrogen, like we looked at every organ, so none of them are working quite right. And then during the adolescence, there are already problems. We can actually pick up PCOS in a 6-year-old. You have to think about it. It's really a pediatric condition because they're usually born already with this. Okay, explodes, see, it shows adulthood, altered hormone profile, PCOS symptoms. So the symptoms of PCOS come out later, but it's already there. And a lot of them, they'll say, I never got rid of my baby fat when they're 7. Like, all my friends would eat the same as me, but I always had like a little muffin top when I was 8. They can actually measure the adipokine, adiponectin. That's a hormone from adipose tissue that is involved in promoting fat burning. Okay, so remember, you have to create energy by burning fat and glucose in the mitochondria, which requires proper estradiol in childhood too, at every age. So even the little girls are already having trouble burning fat, and they're already getting more visceral fat. So we can intervene at a really young age to prevent the worst case manifestations. So I want you to have this to look at later, but you can just see at a glance, by the way, BPA, I'm only focusing on BPA. Why is that? Because that's where the most research has been done. I have to show you the research. So BPA is where the most research is. BPA lowers the number of oocytes and the successful number of births. So that's why it seems rather unlikely that women with PCOS would have really prolonged reproductive lifespans. And it's actually directly toxic to the oocytes, in addition to impacting the estrogen as well. And we'll see what it does with testosterone in a moment. And it also directly affects mitochondria and also indirectly through the estrogen play. And it interferes with the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. There you go, not going to have regular periods. And it increases testosterone, lowers progesterone. It alters all the different things that you've talked about relating to stress and elevates anxiety. Women with PCOS have high rates of depression and anxiety. But not just women with PCOS. That's why PCOS is like, like the foundation to look at. But this applies to every condition for women. Every woman is going to be impacted, and every guy as well. Everyone is impacted by BPA in some fashion. You all know about BPA, right? It's like ubiquitous. It's in can liners. It's in all the plastics. That's why you don't microwave in plastic. I used to have microwavable plastic. Anybody have those things? Oh, yeah, I know. And then we store things in plastic. I had Tupperware, I put hot stuff in Tupperware. And dental sealants were made out of, we'd like paint your kids with BPA, So it's like everywhere. Everyone has BPA in them. It's a question of how well they get rid of it, and that's what we're going to really dive into as well. So look at the impact of BPA. This is like a lot of different toxins. But here you can see BPA is in 2 and 3 and 4. There's others. Remember DES? You remember DES, I'm sure. Yeah, right. Endocrine disruptor did terrible things. And BPA and DES were vying for that role. DES won. BPA, instead of becoming a pharmaceutical, became a plastic. It's kind of weird, isn't it? You're either a drug or you're plastic. I know. It's like surreal. So you can see that BPA is going to increase the production of fat tissue at every stage. So, like, women with PCOS have more fat. Belly fat. BPA causes the production of fat at every stage. So we now have proof that women with PCOS have altered estrogen receptor function. So this is not theory anymore. They don't have proper function of any of their receptors. That's a really big handicap to come into life with, that you can't properly process your estradiol. So if we look here further at BPA, it binds to receptors, and that was also mentioned, that you can have endocrine disruptors acting as agonists or antagonists or both. Look at this. It's so confusing. It acts differently, and who knows, it may even do more than that. This is pretty recent from a major, major journal, mainstream, Fertility Sterility, and that is from 2016, showing what BPA does to estrogen receptors. And by the way, the top one, that's dealing with membrane receptors, which are critical for creating these kinases, like AMP kinase, which promotes fat burning. And so when you have elevation of, or abnormality of what is called, let me make sure I read it right, the aryl hydrocarbon receptor. That is really key to creating energy and modulating energy. So here it's messing up that. It's messing up everything. So you can't properly produce energy. You're going to have more fat, and you're going to have other dysfunctions. So bottom line is it also affects androgens in all kinds of ways. So it reduces the ability to detoxify and eliminate testosterone, and testosterone in turn affects the ability of the body to eliminate BPA. How bad can you get? Downward spiral. More of each. So here shows exactly some of this effect. Direct effect of bisphenol A on the ovaries to cause increased production of testosterone, and then it actually affects the body so that you can't actually bind the testosterone, so you actually have more free testosterone, and then when you have more testosterone, you can't eliminate the BPA. Really challenging, huh? And it alters the genes so that it makes people more prone to cancer and fatty liver. And it alters the circadian rhythm, which we now know is about metabolic homeostasis. You can't have a healthy person. This is what's said all morning long. right? If you don't get sleep, if you're doing things at the wrong time, if you're doing shift work, you're really in trouble. Women with PCOS live a life of jet lag. It's like they're always crossing time zones because their circadian rhythm is never right. So when you don't have a proper circadian rhythm, you have abnormal lipid processing, and some of the key enzymes that deal with like the receptors, I'm sure you've heard of the peroxisome proliferator activated receptors, also known as like PPAR. There's alpha and delta and gamma. They're really critical for energy production. They're all messed up when you have these endocrine disruptors. And it alters the endocannabinoid system. You heard just briefly something about cannabis, and this is actually not in my book. This is like really new stuff, but the endocannabinoid system is probably messed up in women with PCOS, but it all links together, as we'll see. So let's look at the endocannabinoid system. So the endocannabinoid system is in most creatures on this planet. They've found it goes back like to creatures living over 600 million years ago, and it's involved in everything in the body, like you name it, and of course, reproduction, because everything in the body is designed to support reproduction, not the other way around. Remember, reproduction is the foundation of life, not like an tacked-on addition. Take away reproduction, you have no life. So here, a little view of the endocannabinoid system. There are receptors for it. It's like there's endocannabinoids, and there's endocannabinoid receptors, and then there's endocannabinoid-like products, and there's also other kinds of receptors that react with the endocannabinoid system. So that's like a half a day of a lecture, because the endocannabinoid system is very complex. So just as an overview, it's everywhere. Uh-oh, that's kind of like estrogen. They're related. A lot of people don't know this. The endocannabinoid system and estradiol are intimately related. They're connected. Everything's connected. Once you realize that, you see the connections of everything, because it's like one body. So the endocannabinoid system, most people think of it, it's about headaches. You give, for pain, you give some kind of cannabis product. A lot of us use hemp, right? Probably more than marijuana-based. And so they think of it for gut health and brain health and something like immune health. Well, what is that all about? It's all about supporting a healthy reproductive system. So as we'll see, the endocannabinoid system is involved in every single step of reproduction. There are endocannabinoid receptors on the ovary, on the tube, in the uterus, and the endocannabinoid system is critical to reproduction at every phase. The endocannabinoid system is about ovulation, about the tube picking up the egg, carrying it where it's fertilized, moving it down at the right rate, putting it into the uterine cavity, and it's the endocannabinoids that create what I call the parting of the Red Sea. Have you ever wondered, how does an embryo get implanted into the uterine wall? How does that even happen? The endocannabinoids cause the muscles to actually move. They actually, it's like amazing. It's like parting of the Red Sea, and in goes the blastocyst. It's like amazing. So how does this link to estrogen anyway, and women with PCOS? Well, one of the endocannabinoids is called anandamide. Okay, that was the first one that was discovered back in the early 1990s, which is not ancient history in my life. So anandamide works on both, but primarily the CB1 receptor. And it turns out that estradiol and anandamide have a very critical relationship together. So estradiol downregulates the enzyme FAAH that degrades anandamide. So it increases the presence of anandamide. And it also directly causes the production of more anandamide. In turn, high levels of anandamide, when things are working normally, it downregulates the production of the gonadotropins, particularly LH, but also FSH, so you make less estradiol. So a lot of people don't know this, because here, this is just showing you that the reproductive system is all about the endocannabinoid system. During the reproductive cycle, during the menstrual cycle, you have high levels of the endocannabinoids, both the 2-AG and anandamide, you have high levels in the follicular phase, and then they spike highest at ovulation, and then they're very low in the luteal phase, and they stay very low through all of pregnancy, and then jump up to initiate labor. So it's like really a fascinating thing. So, and estrogen and the endocannabinoid system are intimately linked. And now we have a lot of dysfunction of the endocannabinoid system where we have extreme upregulation of CB1 and overproduction of anandamide, which then downregulates the estrogen. And we'll see that anandamide, high levels of CB1, is actually promotes fatty liver and metabolic chaos. So that's really an interesting discovery, and a lot of people live in a state of endocannabinoid disruption, where they have too much of the CB1 and the anandamide, and it's now believed that women with PCOS also have that problem. And so the endocannabinoid system is key to metabolic health, and it's so easy to get this because reproduction, to be successful, requires healthy metabolic function. So it's all linked. So they now have shown that the endocannabinoid system is very key for regulating energy balance and appetite, inflammation, vascular health, adipose function, and related to insulin resistance. So a dysregulated endocannabinoid system is going to lead to metabolic dysfunction. So this is just to show you the complexity of it and how it links with the whole fat, with inflammation-producing fat if you have too much CB1. So that's EC is for endocannabinoid. That would be primarily anandamide, sometimes 2-AG. They both work on both receptors, but anandamide more on CB1. And so it's all linked with fat and energy production. And when you have too much CB1 action and too much of the anandamide, you're going to have too much production of fat. And the endocannabinoid system as well is extraordinarily circadian. So it's about appetite. So here's a non-estrogen answer quiz question. Would you think that you would have high anandamide? So, and let me give you a better preface here. Anandamide increases appetite. Okay? Now, which part of marijuana works on the CB1 receptor? It's THC. Yeah, THC. So that's like gives you the munchies, or so they say, right? Gives you the munchies. So anandamide gives you the munchies. So would nature have it that you would have high or low anandamide at 2 a.m.? No. Right. But when you have dysfunction, you're going to be hungry, right? So I want you to just get acquainted with the endocannabinoid system. I want you to be like ahead of the curve, because most people don't know anything about this, that is how it's linked to reproductive health and linked to PCOS. So there's now some data. Look, I quoted 2 articles here, and there's more coming out, that dysfunction of the endocannabinoid system with and they've done a mouse model where they have overactivation of the anandamide, AEA stands for anandamide, and the CB1 receptor, that's R is receptor, and it results in overproduction of insulin resistance. Wow, that's like a whole new way of thinking about this whole system. And so women with PCOS are so complex, and this also, remember, links to reproduction. Remember, I told you, and I know you were paying attention, that during the luteal phase, you have to have low endocannabinoids. And during pregnancy, you have to have low. Well, what if you're dysregulated and you have high? Then you're going to have problems with progesterone, short luteal phase, miscarriages. So we can think of all of these things as interlinked. So in terms of progesterone is very key to the whole process of pregnancy. Remember, pregnancy is the whole point of life. Doesn't mean that we have to get pregnant all the time, but what other creature on planet Earth tries to regulate their fertility? Not even teenagers sometimes, right? So nature, we're like the only ones that try to do this. So progesterone has receptors on immune cells as well, and it suppresses a lot of the immune responses for T helper 1 and 17, and it upregulates Th2 during pregnancy and also in the luteal phase, and it suppresses the immune system so that in a way that you don't create antibodies to kill pregnant, the fetus. So that's one of the reasons the whole hormones of pregnancy are like immune modulators. So you know how there are a lot of autoimmune diseases that actually improve during pregnancy? Their symptoms improve because the immune system is being modulated by our hormones. But that helps you to understand how these hormones are working. And progesterone has exactly the opposite effect, and it actually upregulates the FAA production. Remember, I mentioned FAA is one of the enzymes. It's much more complicated than this, but it's one of the key enzymes that degrades anandamide. And progesterone makes sure that you really upregulate that so that you get rid of it. As soon as progesterone comes on the scene, it's like, get rid of that stuff. Get rid of those endocannabinoids that are affecting, pregnancy. And it also alters the enzyme that causes the production of anandamide. So it's all about reducing those things. That's why, just a take-home message, you shouldn't smoke marijuana if you want to get pregnant, right? That's really a dangerous thing, or in pregnancy, because it can alter all of the way that these hormones are working. So where does the microbiome fit into this? Well, you already saw the endocannabinoid system and estrogen have receptors throughout the entire gut, and the gut is integral to everything: metabolic health, reproductive health, mental health, immune health, because it's one. So this is so simple. I mean, it's so complex and so simple at the same time because everything is linked to everything. So wouldn't it be terrible if there was a diet that was great for the brain and terrible for the heart? Or if you got enough sleep, you were really fertile, but you would probably get cancer? I mean, it doesn't work that way, so that's really good. So it's one body and it's all linked, and we have to have a healthy microbiome. And unfortunately, back to BPA. BPA also disrupts the normal gut flora. And what's EE? Does anyone know EE? Ethinyl estradiol. Do you know what ethinyl estradiol officially is? An endocrine disruptor. Go to the toxicology.gov, and it's listed there. Ethinyl estradiol endocrine disruptor. What is it in? Birth control pills. And I'll have a little section on that. So there's actually a researcher out of Harvard, who's a gastroenterologist, who has published showing that when women go on birth control pills and also when they go through menopause, their gut microbiome is altered. Well, that's not very shocking because they don't have the normal estrogen, and estrogen is controlling your endocannabinoid system as well. So, of course, that is what is going to happen. And we now have data that shows that women with PCOS have altered gut microbiomes. Not surprising, they have gut dysbiosis, they have markers for lipopolysaccharides that are increased, and remember I told you that the immune cells all have estrogen receptors. Women with PCOS have malfunction of their estrogen receptors. So it's like their immune cells, like their innate immune cells, like their mast cells, they're like weapons of mass destruction without control. So it shows, and this was discovered in research at the University of Indiana way back at the end of the 1990s, like 1998, that the immune cells of women with PCOS are low to explode with their inflammatory cytokines. It takes a lesser trigger. They're like super sensitive. So if you have a leaky gut, and let me show you, let me go to this one. So if you have like a leaky gut, and this is showing the top part here, is showing where you have healthy. See, it says mucus layer, no inflammation, healthy gut barrier. That's the top half. And the bottom is the exact opposite. It says unresolved inflammation, compromised gut barrier. So if you have this leaky gut and you have endotoxins or lipopolysaccharides coming through, and here you have all these immune cells in the gut-associated lymphoid tissue. And see, this is a dendritic cell. See, it puts a little finger through. The barrier is not supposed to be a complete barrier. It's supposed to be a controlled barrier. So I liken it to prohibition. I'm sure none of you remember Prohibition, but you heard of it, right? So this is what they did at the speakeasy. It's like, that's a special code. And then they would open the door and they could get in. So that's how it is for the barrier. It's not supposed to be a barrier. It's supposed to be a selective barrier so that nutrients can get in. And the little dendritic arms, now they're like our own antenna. So they go out and they test what's going on. And you see what it's doing? It's communicating through toll-like receptors to another immune cell. And ultimately, they go and talk to the lymphoid cells here, and then the B cells can also work to make antibodies. So that's all that immune stuff going on in here. But when you have bad stuff, because here's our bacteria, here's our metabolites, and also you'd make lipopolysaccharides, endotoxin, when you have the wrong stuff in there. And then these toxins come through, and these immune cells explode with their inflammatory cytokines. And that inflammation goes everywhere, to the brain. And then, there's receptors to the short-chain fatty acids, like butyrate, on the vagus nerve. Oh, what if you don't make enough butyrate? Then you don't have the right signal there either. More anxiety, please. So that's a big problem. And going back here for a moment, it shows here that you already know that a high-fat diet, a high-sugar diet causes gut problems and endotoxemia. That's where you have toxins leaking out the gut. It also wreaks havoc with our circadian rhythm. So these are the things that are coming into play with women with PCOS. They have problems with their estrogen production, estrogen receptor, and then their immune cells are not right. They're like fast to the trigger to release their inflammatory cytokines. They have gut dysbiosis, circadian rhythm dysfunction. No wonder they're having so much trouble. And this is just to show you that in order for this whole process to happen, and you make the proper short-chain fatty acids, which then also there's signaling agents in the lining cells. See where it says IgN? That stands for intestinal gluconeogenesis. It's not making sugar that circulates. It's making sugar that acts as a signal to help the liver know what's going on. And you can see that there's all the signaling between the brain and the liver. So if you have a gut problem, you got a brain problem, you got a liver problem. The liver, the metabolic powerhouse of the body. Women with PCOS have high rates of liver inflammation and fatty liver. But what's first? What can you not? You can't make all these nice things. All these, acetate, butyrate, propionate, these short-chain fatty acids, which have multiple roles. They're signaling agents, they're food. But what's first in the line? Fiber. Clue, I like fiber. Right? Notice it doesn't say fat. Okay, spoiler alert, I'm not for a ketogenic diet. So here, this is just telling you that I already told you that the endocannabinoid system is extraordinarily circadian and links to all of these genes that regulate metabolic health. And the gut is incredibly circadian. And the enteric nervous system is very circadian. You're supposed to be quiet at night. Your gut, if you have a patient who has to go to the bathroom and poop all night long, that's a problem for many reasons, but that's circadian as well. So short-chain fatty acids are circadian. Toll-like receptors are circadian. Everything is circadian. Women with PCOS live a life of jet lag. Who else lives a life of jet lag? Menopausal women. Yeah. And also people who live a life of jet lag. Uh-oh, that's some of us. And this is showing you, okay, so we have to have a little, you have to think yourself, would you want to be this little guy or this little guy? That's this one or this one. This one, the top one, is eating in a time-restricted way. In other words, according to our circadian rhythm, the way we're supposed to eat, like have breakfast, not eat in the middle of the night. This person is having dysregulated feeding, and look, it's a little butterball, metabolic disorder. So this can also happen even if you don't have PCOS. But if you have PCOS, it's even more problematic. So that's why this applies to everyone. So here, you can see that everything is linked with the circadian rhythm. Metabolic function is very linked to circadian. And time-restricted feeding is one of the tools that we can use to help our women with PCOS, and everybody else too. So this is just showing you, and this is really fun. It just shows you how everything is timed. We're day people and we're night people. We're not, like somebody said, we're not bats. Bats are nocturnal. We are diurnal, and everything is on a clock. About 1/3 of all the genes in our body are clock genes, and about 90% are related in some fashion to clock genes. So everything is on the clock. The gut microbes are on the clock. Every living creature on the planet, including single-celled creatures, have clock genes. Plants have clock genes. So everything has a clock gene. But our gut microbes don't know what time it is unless we feed them according to the clock. We can set their beat by the beat of our eating. But if you remember who was mentioned, like maybe we should fast between meals, right? Like that's a good place to start, right? So if we eat, there are people that have like a Starbucks drink that has who knows what in it, but it has definitely calories, and they're drinking it all day long from beginning to the end before they go to bed. That's like there's no break. There are microbes in their gut. They don't know what time it is. And the gut microbes are very circadian. In fact, there are certain microbes that swarm to melatonin. So you know the gut makes a lot of melatonin, and they actually swarm like insects around them when the melatonin comes out. It's like so fascinating. We have different gut microbiomes at different times of the day. So I'm not even sure what we're doing when we're collecting stool samples at a certain time, because that's going to be different at a different time. But so we are very circadian. In fact, they're not like they're coming and going, like I'm sure they're not disappearing, but they're definitely different. They have different activities at different times of the day. And they're definitely altered when you have less estrogen or endocrine disruptors, or if you constantly eat or eat at different times, different days of the week. That's called social jet lag, when you eat all kinds of crazy times, and also just bad habits. And here is just showing that their circadian rhythm is in the brain, and that's affected by all these things, including light and dark. And I use light therapy. Who loves light? You know, the dermatologists say never go outside. Like cover up. What is with that? So I love light. So here's another little helpful hint. When light comes in and hits the eye, there are certain retinal receptors that go straight to the master clock in the brain to set the time. But it's even more than that. When light comes in the eye, you make serotonin. It triggers the production of serotonin. And guess what? Serotonin neurons, there are acetylcholine neurons, there are serotonin neurons. What hormone is critical to the function of both? Yeah, people don't know that. And when light comes in the eye, you make serotonin, and then at night, you make it into melatonin. That's why who's ever gone and spent the whole day at the beach in the bright sun, and then when they got home, they just fell asleep and they slept like a baby? Because light helps you sleep. Light helps you feel good. So light is medicine. So we have to, now we don't want to have a burn, but we don't want to go the other crazy direction. And in fact, they've actually shown that people who get a lot of sunlight and who do develop a melanoma have a much higher survival rate than people who never go outside and develop a melanoma, which, by the way, happens a lot in melanoma. It's not just light-exposed areas. So circadian rhythm is everywhere. And every cell in the body has a circadian rhythm, and they have peripheral clocks. So we have the master clock, and then we have peripheral clocks. And the peripheral clocks are in all the different cells, including the ovaries. Shift workers and PCOS women who are always like in a jet lag, they have much lower rates of fertility, more depression, more metabolic syndrome, more breast cancer. There are ovarian clocks, estrogen, well, we know estrogen is in the ovary, but melatonin. There are receptors for melatonin on the ovaries. When you get enough sleep, you improve your fertility. So we have to help our women with PCOS to get to sleep. And I do use melatonin. It's not my first line, but if I can't get them to sleep or feel good, or they have a lot of acid reflux, I add in melatonin. Because there also is some data, just to make matters worse, that women with PCOS also probably have some melatonin receptor problems. You know, it's not going to be just one hormone, unfortunately. So we need to recognize that you can help to set the clocks of all these organs by timed eating. When you eat matters, not just what you eat, that matters too. So here's some of the different ways that you can entrain. That's the word we use to set. We use the word entrainment, entrain the clocks of the liver. And notice, see, it has glucocorticoids. You heard a lot about that this morning, but it shows feeding. That's my favorite way to try to set the clocks of the liver in addition to everything else. And here it just shows that everything is circadian. You can see there's a temperature drop. If someone is urinating all night long, that's a sign that they very well likely have sleep apnea and circadian rhythm dysfunction, because your bladder should not fill. You see the bladder, the urine volume should be very low. That little gray strip, that's night, and the middle of the gray strip is 2 a.m. That's 2 a.m. So you can see at 2 a.m. your melatonin is really high and your cortisol is very low, as it should be. But that's not all. You see, thyrotropin, thyroid is related. Growth hormone is circadian, more at night. Everybody knows children grow at night, but growth hormone isn't just about growing, it's about maintaining. It has growth hormone, that's the problem with the names of a hormone, right? Like anti-Mullerian hormone, people don't know what the heck that means, and growth hormone, they think it's just about growing. But it's about maintaining lean body mass, all kinds of good stuff. And blood pressure changes at night. People who don't dip, their blood pressure doesn't dip, they're more likely to have strokes. And women with PCOS are more prone to hypertension and cardiovascular disease. Women with PCOS have 4 times the chance of developing diabetes. So these are very serious things, and they have problems with their circadian rhythm at night. Night is when everything improves and heals. Look at the cerebral blood flow at night. So think of what's happening to your brain if you don't sleep, right? You're not getting that restorative blood flow. And this is to prove to you that I am not making up that estrogen controls the circadian rhythm. It's not the only thing. You can mess up the circadian rhythm in many different ways, but if you don't have estrogen, it's really hard to have a healthy circadian rhythm. And here is to show you how it's linked to reproduction. I rest my case. Because circadian rhythm is about maintaining the whole body working in unison for the support of reproduction. Because look here, it shows SCN. That stands for suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the master clock in the brain. And look here, it says ER beta. Actually, there is some alpha too. Nothing is 100%, but it's more dominant. So ER beta stands for estrogen receptor beta. Now, remember I told you estrone is almost all alpha. So if you're giving estrogen that's only alpha, like you're giving oral estrogen or Premarin, you're not really working on the circadian clock, right? And then here on this side, where it shows E2, remember E2, look at all these E2s. That's estradiol. And here it shows this area. You know what this stuff is? Those are the nutrient sensors of the hypothalamus. Yep. And see, it says ER alpha. ER alpha is very heavily in the hypothalamus about regulating metabolic functions, appetite and controlling, all the metabolic things like fat burning. A lot of the innate immune cells are alpha. And it controls the production of the kisspeptins, which signal the release of the releasing hormones, which signal the pituitary to put out the gonadotropins LH and FSH. Wow. Our bodies want to know that a woman has a proper nutritional state to allow reproduction to occur. And you heard that, like what happens when people are anorexic, or they're not eating properly, they're obese, they don't have proper nutrient status. The brain wants to know, and estrogen is in charge. And it controls all of this, and now you already know the metabolic functions of the body are all circadian. So it's all one. It makes it really simple once you know this. Now, when you get on a cellular level, it's very complex, but the fundamentals are not. And we now have data to show that women with PCOS have a flipped circadian rhythm. Not 100% of women who've tested 100%, but we have data to show that at least a substantial number at night, when their cortisol should be low, it's high, and in the morning when it should be high, it's low. So they think they're night owls. You already heard, if you're a night owl, you're a messed up person, because you are not an owl. You are a human. I know. What is that? Like, I'm a vampire. No, no. So, oh my gosh, women with PCOS are in fact living a life of jet lag. So what can we do for them? We have to help them. We already talked a little. This is just showing you that insulin is timed. So if you eat even healthy food at night, you're stressing out your pancreas. You cannot change your genes. It would be like, I hate turning around when I'm driving, and I want to keep driving my old car because I don't want to get the new one that has like the camera that shows me behind, and I don't want to go around because my neck cracks, okay? So I'm going to put another eye behind my head. Oh, no, I can't do that. I'm not programmed genetically for that. We are not programmed to change when our insulin is produced properly. Everything is on the clock. This is a really fun study that showed that when they flipped 12 hours, they turned midnight into noon for just 8 days. Look what happened. Glucose went up a little, but look what happened to leptin. It plummeted. And leptin is about appetite regulation. By the way, what hormone has a lot of impact on leptin? Yeah, estrogen helps control. And by the way, the endocannabinoid system is linked in with leptin. Everything's linked in. And look what happened to insulin. Oh my gosh, it went up 22%. Can you lose weight if you have high insulin? No, you can't, because you can't multitask like that. Remember, we think we can multitask, but we can't. We can't burn fat and make fat at the same time. If you have high insulin, you are only making fat and storing fat. So this is what happened in just 8 days when they flipped the circadian rhythm. Their blood pressure went up, and look what happened to sleep efficiency. It plummeted. That means all that stuff I showed you that happens at night was messed up. The brain flow, the blood pressure going down, the growth hormone, all that stuff did not function properly. And here's where we all know all the endocrine disruptors, I'm sure. And the circadian rhythm and detoxification pathways are linked. So detoxification, we need to help our patients with PCOS to detoxify better because they carry a heavier toxic load. And circadian rhythm and detoxification are linked. So we need to know that, first off. And what can we do? Well, it turns out that fasting, you all know fasting is pretty trendy. Fasting upregulates detoxification pathways. So this is another tool we can access. And it changes the gut microbiome. It's almost like a reset, a reboot to the gut microbiome when you do fasting. And not just fasting, but also time-restricted eating can help with detoxification pathways. So this is like really interesting. This study, it showed that, that when you fast, you actually flip a switch. Not really a switch, but that's what they called it in the paper. That you flip a switch and you change the way that the clock genes are expressed to completely change how the body works. You change, it's like you're flipping a switch and you go into metabolic betterment, So you're actually activating the genes and the enzymes that help with metabolic health by fasting. And so it's very interesting. You can access this article, and they really talk about it as when you're eating all the time. That's what they call ad libitum, like eating all the time. I just call it eating all the time because my patients don't know those words. So eating all the time, and then here's fasting, you get the switch. So that's like a tool we all must use for our patients. And protective roles of fasting, this is from Professor Longo's work at the Longevity Institute at USC. Look at all these wonderful things that fasting does. You can read them, and you have the slides. I think we want to access that. These are part of our innate mechanisms to restore health, not just in our women with PCOS, but in all of our patients and in ourselves. Who here does any form of fasting? Wow, you guys are so with it. But not everybody does. This is a select group. And once again, fasting helps rewire the metabolism and changes the way genes are expressed, as I mentioned. And it actually upregulates the receptors that work with the genes that actually improve circadian function. And fasting upregulates the sirtuins and increases NAD. Have you all heard of sirtuins? They're also known as histone deacetylases. They're post-transcriptional. In other words, after a protein is made, on the ribosome, it changes it. And sirtuins, that's what everybody wants, is like activate your sirtuins. Fasting does it, and this increases NAD naturally. And so you don't like, if you do everything wrong but you get an NAD infusion, it probably isn't going to serve you, right? So save your money and do something more useful. So you want to activate your natural mechanisms. So this is really fascinating. Fasting upregulates the detoxification in the small intestine, which most people forget about. They forget that the small intestine is part of the detoxification system. And here is just showing what happens in the intestinal site, that it's involved with phase 1 and 2 metabolism. And here it shows phase 1 is all about implementing the cytochrome P450 enzymes, which are like really important. I'm sure you've heard about them. Guess what other thing? Endocannabinoids also interfere in a good way. They're part of the P450 system. So it's all related. Remember I showed you lots of receptors in the gut for the endocannabinoid system and also for estrogen. So what happens when you have fasting is that you actually alter the expression of genes in the small intestine to improve transport and upregulate the enzymes that are involved with detoxification. So we can maybe lower the load. And here it's just the same thing that I said, that it really impacts how the gut is going to function, and it increases the serotonin transporter after 24 hours of fasting, and that's what helps to start getting the gut moving better when you upregulate that. And here's a study from people in Ramadan where they did daytime fasting. After the Ramadan was over, they had dramatic decreases in all of the heavy metals. So it helped them with detoxification. And that's not the same kind of fast. That's not even what we really recommend. But it just shows that if you just pause on eating for a fair few weeks, how beneficial it can be to your patient's detoxification pathways. And it also promotes stem cell regeneration. And what I really wanted to bring out with this slide is this part here. Because this came up so much this morning, the increase in stress resistance, and it decreases DNA damage, right? So if you're going to start measuring 8-hydroxy-DG, we'd like to see it go down, right? So this would be an interesting study, wouldn't it, if we did this with PCOS women. And it upregulates, after you fast, it actually upregulates the immune system. And we just have to be careful. We don't want to do fasting when women are actively trying to get pregnant. We do it before, as part of our pregnancy prep. And if a woman has not enough body fat, it will shut down ovulation. Nature does not want an unhealthy woman reproducing, whether too heavy, too toxic, too thin, too stressed, you name it, that's not good. And here's just showing that when you have exercise and fasting, you upregulate AMP kinase, and then you actually improve, and you have reactive oxygen system defense, and you have increased fatty acid oxidation, and you have neuroprotection. SIRT3 is predominantly mitochondrial sirtuin. And here's just showing that fasting, and also resveratrol, which is part of my toolbox, increases SIRT1, and you can see all the wonderful things that it does. Increase insulin, it helps with the beta cells, and circadian rhythm. So it's all feeding back to each other like a big, beautiful circle once you get on the right path. Because the wrong path, everything was downward spiral. The good path is everything upward spiral. And here is just showing the circadian clock involving the sirtuins. See, here's all the different sirtuins, and the clocks are in the liver and in the brain, and by doing time-restricted eating and fasting, we can upregulate the system. And here's just showing when you have proper feeding and proper fasting, you end up with metabolic homeostasis, resilience, tissue repair, and organismal function in this beautiful expanding circle. So what are we going to do? We can't change a lot of things, so we're going to work with what we can change. So we can certainly incorporate fasting to help with our circadian clocks, work on all the features of lifestyle, work on the gut so we can have metabolic regulation. I had to include these two slides because these were from a hypothesis article from 2012 by my good friend, Professor Kelton Tremelin in Adelaide, Australia. And he predicted everything that came about PCOS, that involves leaky gut, bad diet, and then you have insulin resistance. But the good news was he also predicted that if you gave the right diet, you could actually repair. And that is definitely possible. And when you repair the gut, you also improve the gut production of hormones like GLP-1, which helps regulate appetite. So you can actually get people to stop having those cravings that were talked about. So this is what I do in my office, but you don't have to have all of these things in your office. You can create your own little tribe to incorporate, and you can do a lot of things on your own. So you know about labs, we won't go there. So we definitely want to reduce the toxic load by reducing exposures, and you know how to do that, and checking like the environmental websites. And the diet that I use a lot is a modified MAPI-2 diet, which was actually in diabetics. But you can also use it in women with PCOS, and I've had great results. And it increases the production of short-chain fatty acids, which is so important for gut repair. And what it is a very high complex carbohydrate diet. But it's not involving foods that turn high into sugar rapidly. So we're talking about more resistant starch, whole grains. It means they're not pulverized, they're not powderized, lots of root vegetables, so lots of carbs. Now, the amount of protein looks low, but it's not that they're not eating protein, it's just that the percentage of carbs from resistant starch and the types of fiber that are nurturing the gut microbiome. We need to nurture that gut microbiome. And I recommend trying to start 3 to 6 months of a vegan diet, or as close to it as possible. If they have to eat animal, try to limit it to no more than 3 ounces a day. And most of the protein would come from things like beans and lentils, nuts and seeds, because we're nurturing that gut microbiome. And as well, of course, no alcohol. You know the drill, right? We're not going to give anything that's processed, no toxic foods. We're feeding the microbiome to try to get things right. This is an interesting study. I just took a picture from the study that showed that when you have a dysbiotic gut, the bad bacteria actually destroy the polyphenols. I mean, so we have to work extra hard. Because it's really a fascinating thing that came out that showed, and this actually won an award, this researcher from, I think it was Harvard, and it was in 2018, that when you have gut dysbiosis, it actually destroys the polyphenols. That's why I want more and more and more. I try to aim for like 9 cups a day. That's probably not doable for most. And I say like 3 cups of fruit. I have a new motto, don't be afraid of fruit, you know? Because fruit isn't what's giving people diabetes. It's like BPA and circadian rhythm dysfunction and other toxic things in our lifestyle. It's not because they ate too many apples. Has anyone heard of anyone eating too many apples? I think our bodies can't eat too many apples. It just makes us stop. So it's important to feed our microbes and realize how hard it is to get them right. This is showing the purpose and benefit of resistant starch, like cold potatoes, plantain, because look what it does. It's like wonderful. It improves appetite, it improves cognition, motor performance, it helps repair the gut barrier, and it reduces stress and inflammation, and it increases our ability to detoxify those xenobiotics. So we need to, I mean, so many people with these ketogenic diets, none of this is going to happen. Now, why would a ketogenic diet seem good? Like, why is it? Because basically you're starving out the bad guys. Like, that's why people feel good when they stop eating, you know, or if they eat only fat, because it's also killing the bad guys. It's also killing the good guys. So what I like is, like, you feed, and then you do fasting, which you're starving all the guys, and then you refeed, so you're feeding, nurturing, then you're killing, then you're feeding, nurturing, and you're rebooting, rather than just trying to give lots of fat, because then you're destroying your good guys too. You'll never reestablish a healthy microbiome with a long-term ketogenic diet. But if somebody, they're not saying that there is no place for it in special populations, But for PCOS women and for most people with metabolic syndrome, I think it's a very short-term solution based on starving out your good guys because you're not feeding them with the fat. And diversity of microbiome requires dietary diversity. And it turns out that different microbes love different polyphenols. It's like the dance of the polyphenols and the microbes. So we do want to eat lots of different variety of foods because we don't want to have just one type of microbe, right? It's like a forest. You know, when they cut down a forest and then they say, we're going to put the forest back, and they plant one tree, one type of tree, that's not what a real forest is, just one tree over and over and over. So the gut is very complex. We don't have one microbe. There's trillions in there, and there's thousands of species. So we have to try to support them. And here's just some of my favorite foods that have a lot of polyphenols, but everyone has their own favorites. I am very big on foods that have oil as opposed to lots of oil separately because I'm never sure what they're getting because a lot of oil is oxidized or even adulterated. They say it's olive oil, but it's, you know, corn oil or something. So I like to eat olives, so rather than getting the oil. But if you know the source, and teas are wonderful, and teas are a way of getting herbs without taking a tablet or a capsule. And there's actually data on spearmint tea that it actually lowers androgens and LH and actually has helped with skin. So if people like it, they should try to drink quite a bit of spearmint tea for PCOS. In terms of meal timing, we want them to eat the same time every day. A big breakfast is very good, and they should optimally, like when they're advanced, they could have 2 meals a day, but it's not food restriction, it's just time restriction. And the longer you spend fasting, the better it is for restoring the gut microbes. And 13 hours between dinner and breakfast is probably all you really need. You have very minimal return on investment when you add more and more. And when people do fasting and they say they start eating at like 1 or 2 in the afternoon, please tell them it's better if they eat breakfast and fast at the end. So they stop eating preferably by 7, but you want to try to get 13 hours from dinner to breakfast, and there's published papers showing reduced recurrence of breast cancer in women who get that fast of 13 hours. And then incorporate some form of longer fasting, like a fasting mimicking diet or a water fast for, say, 4 days, once a month for about 3 months in a row, and then 4 times a year. That, you can individualize it, but that can be very, very helpful because it's a different process when you fast during a 24-hour day, which is really time-restricted eating. Intermittent fasting means you fast for 24 hours, and that helps with weight loss. And weight loss is very beneficial, and that's where they do the 2 days a week, the 5-2. But how many people are going to sustain that, where they pretty much eat nothing for 2 days every week? Has anyone been successful with that? It's really hard to implement that. But a fasting where you do like just once a month for a few days or then 4 times a year is much more doable and has tremendous benefits. And here's an Israeli study on PCOS. This is on PCOS that showed in just a short period of time by taking their meals and making most of their food for breakfast and then like 2/3 for breakfast, approximately 1/3 for lunch, and only like a bite for dinner. Look what happened. Their glucose went down, but most importantly, their insulin plummeted and their testosterone plummeted. There's no drug that does that can lower insulin and their testosterone in this was like as short as 1 month. And they started ovulating. And look, their 17-hydroxyprogesterone decreased by 39%. That's a precursor to cortisol. So look at the benefit of time-restricted eating, where when you give that big breakfast, it helps reset the circadian clock. And there are other things that can help as fasting mimetics. So it's like a fake fasting that the body has a lot of the same benefits: resveratrol, alpha-lipoic acid, berberine, and that miracle called exercise. And here's just a few of you have these so you can read. I have my whole protocol here. And it's in the book in much more detail, but these are really key. Myo-inositol is pretty amazing. It really can restore insulin resistance and help with ovulation. And berberine, I'm sure you're very familiar with berberine, and it works probably on the gut, but it also helps with lipids. And when there was one study comparing berberine to metformin, and berberine won. And sleep, we have to work on sleep, so make sure you already heard a lot about this, so I won't go into that much. And exercise actually improves gut microbial diversity. So it's pretty wonderful in so many ways. And it increases nitric oxide production, which is very low in women with PCOS. Nitric oxide is a gas signaling agent and antioxidant, which is really important for vascular health, heart health, and mood, and it's very low in women with PCOS. And I always start with what I call a reset. Sometimes it's like called a detoxification. And I'm sure you're familiar, and I have my protocol there. And then these are a lot of the different supplements that I use. So you have access to all of this and with exact dosing. So I'm not going to go into Catherine's story, but you can read that later. So just a quick thing on conventional studies, therapies. So metformin was mentioned. Metformin is a mainstay. These are the mainstays: metformin, birth control pills, and spironolactone in the conventional medical world. Metformin is an endocrine disruptor and a nutrient depleter. So they keep giving it to women who are pregnant with PCOS, and there's studies showing that it has almost no benefit, nominal benefit on preventing some preterm labor, really minimal. But what it did was, that's all the benefit. It had no effect on preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, all the things that they were trying to give it for had no benefit. And in the babies, when they looked at them 4 years out, the babies matched to women who were not on metformin and women who were on metformin. The children at age 4 of the metformin users throughout pregnancy had higher visceral fat. They were already developing metabolic syndrome. Remember, in the wild, there's a lot of studies of the environmental science world showing that in the wild, metformin is clearly an endocrine disruptor, and it's filling our lakes and rivers because it enters into the water from the treatment plants unchanged. And so it's actually affecting not just the genitalia, which it is, but also the metabolic functions of the wildlife. And it's very much deemed an endocrine disruptor in the literature. So, and that's what we're giving our pregnant women with PCOS. I think this is a big mistake. Spironolactone is a very serious teratogen, so I always worry about giving something that's going to alter the way a baby forms. It just doesn't feel good to me. And oral contraceptives, I already told you, are officially endocrine disruptors. And not only that, there's actually published data that women with PCOS who inherently have a thrombophilic state, as do women in menopause. Estrogen is anti-thrombophilic. I know that goes against what you hear, but that's because they're studying endocrine disruptors. Well, if you're going to study an endocrine disruptor, it's going to have a different effect, which is usually negative. So if it's like BPA, if you called BPA estrogen, and then you did a study on BPA, and then your conclusion was estrogen is horrible, that doesn't seem really fair. But that's what they're doing. They're studying endocrine disruptors. So birth control pills increase blood clots in women with PCOS, and that's been published, and that doesn't sound good to me. And also increases insulin resistance, and this was one meta-analysis of the OC literature and was not very complimentary to oral contraceptives. On the defense of oral contraceptives, it does increase through the liver sex hormone binding globulin, which binds up testosterone, so there's less to affect the skin. So that, and of course they don't have cycles because they're on birth control pills, so they don't make any of their hormones from their ovaries. But it does sometimes reduce a little bit hirsutism and acne in some women. But the problem is it does all these other negative things. It's not fixing the problem. It's lowering nitric oxide. So birth control pills lower nitric oxide and increase blood clotting and increase diabetes and metabolic problems and hypertension, right? You don't give birth control pills to women who have uncontrolled hypertension or smokers. Why? Women with PCOS have similar risk factors for cardiometabolic dysfunction. Why are you giving them to all these women? But that's what they do over and over. Birth control pills also increase autoimmune disease. So I put this up just to show how it's all together. that you have the immune system, you have the gut, you have inflammation, you have circadian rhythm, and all links together into one person, in one person's body. So what happened to my patient, Lori? She did not get that job, but her mom referred her to me. And 6 months later, she had lost 30 pounds. She started having cycles every other month. A year, 6 months beyond that, so now it's a year out, she was having regular cycles. She had actually lost 55 pounds. She was sleeping. She did have sleep apnea. She was using a CPAP, and we hope that she'll be able to get off of that. Her skin is dramatically better. Her hair is starting to grow back, but you can't replace, lost hair, and you can't get rid of the hair that's there, so she's getting laser hair reduction for the hair that's already there. She has self-confidence. She has a boyfriend, and she got a new dream job. So Lori does have that happy ending that I always require, because I love happy endings. So when you have a life that has light and love and activity and fitness, when you have circadian rhythm function, when you eat and you sometimes don't eat, then everyone can live the fairy tale life, or at least come a lot closer to it and live happily ever after. Thank you.